I'm Mike Hannewald, field agronomist with Beck's Hybrids. I want to spend some time talking about wheat planting. As the soybeans come off, it's time to think about heading to the field and putting wheat in the ground for those of us that do that here in Ohio. So a couple things I want to think about. First of all, the question on a lot of farmers' minds right now is, should we be planting into the dry soils that we have? And my answer is yes. There's the old saying, if you plant in the dust, your bins will bust. And wheat likes dry conditions. And yes, it does need moisture to germinate, and so the wheat won't germinate quite as if there's no moisture in the soil. However, history tells us that we almost always get rains throughout the fall, and wheat is a very resilient crop that even if it doesn't germinate into perfect conditions or perfect evenness, it will still produce a good crop. And getting an early planting date into dry soil conditions is not something that we are overall too worried about. The next question comes to planting depth. And so if you look at our PFR data, you would see that 1 inch is our PFR proven planting depth that we've tested over multiple years. However, I'm going to recommend that we use 1 inch as a minimum, and especially for us in northern Ohio, maybe look at going just a little bit deeper than that. The reason is that planting depth is where we're going to set a majority of our root system, and by giving it just a little bit of extra depth, that helps to keep that root system anchored in. If we would get below freezing conditions and bitter cold conditions this winter without snow cover, that ground, that freezing and thawing of the ground can potentially cause heaving. And if we plant too shallow or don't have a fully developed root system in place, that wheat can heave up out of the ground and cause some stand loss going into the spring. So PFR says 1 inch. I'm okay with going down to 1.5 inches. Just kind of use that inch as a minimum, especially with drills fluctuating some. Get it all at least 1 inch of the ground and you should be just fine. Next comes to planting population. So wheat actually acts a lot like what soybeans do in the fall when we are talking about planting population. So just like with soybeans, we recommended when you plant early to keep your populations lower. When you plant on high productive soils, keep your populations lower. And so if you're drilling in 7.5 inch rows, our recommendation would be to plant between 1.4 million to 2 million seeds per acre, being on the lower end of that range for high productive soils planted early. And as your soil productivity decreases and as your planting date gets later, to go ahead and increase that population. Now, one thing that I might recommend is, even if you're able to plant fairly early here at the end of September, you might consider, because of the dry conditions, increasing that population just a little bit, because likely that wheat's going to emerge later due to the dry soils. And so it's more about the date of germination and emergence that sets our population in a year like this one, not necessarily the date that we plant. So you might want to bump up just a little bit, but that 1.4 to 2 million is where you want to be. And then if you're planting wheat in 15-inch rows with a planter, that's becoming more common. We would recommend decreasing that recommendation by 400 to 500,000. So we'd be looking at about 1 to 1.5 million seeds per acre in 15-inch rows. Next thing to cover with wheat is fertilizer. And so fertilizer is very important, getting that wheat off to a good start. And so just like in a corn crop, we recommend some nitrogen and sulfur as a starter fertilizer. We're going to recommend the same thing for wheat. Would like to see 30 pounds of nitrogen and 3 pounds of sulfur. Follow that 10-to-1 ratio to get that wheat off to a good start. Nitrogen and sulfur are both very important for tiller development, and your fall tillers are going to be far more successful at developing a full head and full yield potential than what any tillers you might develop in the spring. And so getting that nitrogen on in the fall to stimulate fall growth, get that fall tillering in place before the wheat goes dormant is really important. We also don't want to forget about P and K. Phosphorus and potassium are both very important for a wheat crop, and we don't necessarily want to just count on there being enough left over from the previous year soybean crop, because we know soybeans are high users of those nutrients as well. Now, when we're looking at a lower price scenario like we're faced with today's markets, fertility might be one of the areas that we might look to cut costs. And if you've got good, reliable soil tests and you factored in the appropriate crop removal from a previous corn or soybean crop, you can cut back on fertility and do it confidently. But you have to have good soil tests that show that you have high enough levels in the soil to feed that wheat crop. We want to see phosphorus at a minimum of 25 parts per million, and then potassium following the tri-state recommendations based on your CEC. Moving forward then, last thing to talk about is weed control. We don't want to forget about that. So some farmers will do tillage ahead of planting wheat in the fall and use that as their weed control, and they're tearing out any of those late weeds that are in their soybeans, particularly winter annuals that we're concerned about, especially things like mare's tail and pennycrest get started in the fall. That we want to make sure that we're tearing those out successfully with tillage. However, with the decreased moisture, we might want to consider doing no-till, and many farmers just no-till their wheat to begin with as well. And so in that case, I would recommend a herbicide application of glyphosate and sharpen. Running a lower rate of glyphosate, 22 ounces of 5.4-pound glyphosate should be sufficient, and then add to that 1 ounce of sharpen. That's a really solid program that will kill any weeds that are out there behind the combine after you take off your soybean crop. But then also that sharpen gives you just a little bit of residual to get you through the fall and keep that field clean with no competition for that wheat crop. So if you have any questions about these or any other recommendations when it comes to wheat planting or any other agronomic topic that you might see this fall, feel free to reach out to myself or your local Beck's representative, and we'd be happy to help. Just want to wish you a safe and successful harvest.